Now I'll introduce Laurie Pearce. Laurie Pearce is a lecturer in Akkadian in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research interests focus on Mesopotamian social and economic history of the late first millennium BCE. She is particularly interested in the relationship between minority populations and the powers that rule them, especially populations deported to Babylonia in the wake of Nebuchadnezzar's Levantine campaigns. Her book almost needs no introduction. We've been talking about it all this while, but in 2014, she co-published with Dr. Cornelia Wunsch the book Documents of Judean Exiles and West Semites in Babylonia in the collection of David Sofer, and she is the author of a number of papers dedicated to the social identification and locations of the Judeans in Babylonia. She is coordinating, with the participation of Kathleen Abraham of Leuven and Peter Zilberg of Hebrew University, a digital project called ForBab, Foreigners in Babylonia in the First Millennium. The project, which incorporates legacy data from the project of cuneiform texts mentioning Israelites, Judeans, and related population groups, courtesy of Yoram Cohen and Ron Sadok, should launch in late 2023 or early 2024. This is on the ORAC Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus platform. I'd like to welcome Laurie Pearce to give her talk, Through a Babylonian Looking Glass, What is the Problem with Foreign Wives?
Thank you, Tawny, for the introduction. Thank you, God, for the invitation. When I opened the invitation, I thought, how can I contribute to a conference on Yahwism? And I was about ready to say no. And then I read the next sentence and I quote, "There is no need to deal with Yahwism directly in any way." At which point I felt a great deal of relief. This was very reassuring because I was quite certain that there was no Yahwism in this bunch of scrappy tablets from southern Babylonia, a confirmation that Professor Gratz kindly contributed to in his talk. So absolved of the burden to stick closely to the conference theme, I decided to make this my first post-plague or nearly post-plague conference week, and I'm delighted to be here to meet new friends and see colleagues of long standing. What I present today is something of a thought exercise. I'm going to explore whether evidence for Babylonian marriage and intermarriage can offer any perspective on Ezra's problem with the foreign wives. And as Ezra is definitely uncharted waters for me, I invite your comments and your responses to my adventure. For they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the peoples of the land. Yea, the hand of the princes and rulers hath been first in this faithlessness. And when I heard this thing, I rent my garment and my mantle, and plucked off the hair of my head and of my beard, and sat down appalled. Then were assembled unto me every one that trembled at the words of the God of Israel, because of the faithlessness of them of the captivity, and I sat appalled until the evening offering. The report of intermarriage between the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the peoples of the lands may have appalled Ezra, but it can hardly have surprised him. Ezra had been resident in Babylonia, an environment where intermarriage between Babylonians and descendants of deported populations, among them Judeans, was an established practice. Even if he did not or could not read cuneiform documents, Ezra, along with many members of the exilic Judean community, would have observed marriages among the elite as well as among non-elite Babylonians. While Ezra's declamation served a clear theological program, I suggest that his response should also be viewed in connection with social and economic conditions in Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid period Babylonia, with particular focus on those that defined marriage practice. In his 2009 Ethnicity, Genealogy, Geography, and Change, Gary Knoppers stated that, quote, "In the story of Ezra, one encounters not one, but two imagined Israelite communities. One group, a relatively new community. is centered in the large city of Babylon, while another resides far away in the ancestral homeland of Judah. The native community receives the bulk of attention in the book, but the diasporic community drives the action. Knopper continues. The returnees living back in their ancestral territory derive their primary identity neither from their homeland nor from their eponymous ancestor, but from their ancestral links to the diaspora. Knoppers builds his analysis of the process and account of identity formation in Ezra by reading the narrative against the grain, and argues that it advocates a Judean identity that is, in his words, trans-temporal and international, and again in his words, promotes an intergenerational process of Judean identity reformation that reshapes the homeland community according to mores developed and cultivated in the diaspora. This visitor to the world of the multifarious discussions of Ezra's theologically motivated remonstrance of those who married foreign brides aims to engage with Knopper's framing in the following ways. First, I will review previous studies of documents of the marriages of Judean brides and intermarriage in the Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid periods. Second, I will summarize recent studies of the nature of social networks in Babylonian marriages and of a perceived shift in late Achaemenid period documentation of marriage practices. And finally, raise questions about whether or how this evidence may enrich our understanding of the historical, social, and economic factors shaping the environment in which Ezra issued his decree. I begin with a review of cuneiform evidence relating to marriage and intermarriage. Ultimately, I will focus in particular on sources from the long 6th century. To the best of my knowledge, the cuneiform corpus preserves no injunction, "Thou shalt not intermarry." Yet it records both explicit and implicit constraints on marriage. Passages in the law collections and details in legal and administrative documents that establish boundaries and reflect limits imposed on marriage arrangements are related to the social, economic, and legal status of the groom and bride. As early as the laws of Ur-Nama, who ruled from about 2012 to 2094, social and legal implications of marriages between individuals of different social standings are raised. Although Ur-Nama considers the social consequences for the offspring of a marriage between a male slave and a native woman, the term native really offers no information about her social standing, rendering this source more of interest than helpful in the discussion. The better preserved laws of Hammurabi address several scenarios in which there is disparity between the social and or economic standing between husband and wife. Paragraphs 175 to 176 A and B address marriages between slaves of the palace or of commoners who marry into the Awilam class, which enjoys personal freedom. For example, paragraph 125, if a slave of the palace or a slave of a commoner marries a woman of the Awilu class, and she then bears children, the owner of the slave will have no claims of slavery against the children of the woman of the Awilu class. Perhaps paragraph 128 of the Laws of Hammurabi addresses the formal process of validation of marriage. It stipulates, Shumma awilum ashatam ichuzma riksat tisha laishkun sinishtum shi al ashat. If a man marries a wife, but does not draw up a formal contract for her, she is not a wife. This stands in contrast to paragraph 9 of the Neo-Babylonian laws, which states, a man who makes an oral promise of the dowry for his daughter or writes it on a tablet for her, and whose estate later decreases, he shall give to his daughter a dowry in accordance with the remaining assets of his estate. The father-in-law, that is the bride's father, and the groom will not, by mutual agreement, alter the commitments. This paragraph serves as the basis for the communis opinio that in the Neo-Babylonian period, a verbal agreement, or perhaps a handshake, was sufficient to effect a contract for marriages which included no special circumstances. Although these passages provide a glimpse into social aspects of marriage in Mesopotamia, recall that the law collections record ideal practice, not case law, and that the laws in the collections did not address conditions of specific marriages. They certainly do not account for exceptional circumstances. For such information about real marriages, if you will, we turn to the corpus of legal and administrative documents in the Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid period. From 626 to 484 BCE, the long 6th century, the relevant corpus includes nearly 60 cuneiform marriage documents, of which a handful are too damaged to be particularly useful. Additionally, there are many tablets dealing with matters other than marriage, which provide evidence for understanding the larger context for urban social environments in which marriages occurred. We will now look at 2 marriage documents that reference West Semitic and/or Judean brides, which will be ultimately included in our consideration of how or whether these bear on Ezra's concern with foreign wives. The first text is the marriage contract of a woman named Nanaya Kanat, which Professor Tzadok has just discussed. Kathleen Abraham published it in Archiv für Orientforschung, 2005-2006. The contract was written in Yahudu, the Babylonian mirror town, to which many Judean deportees were settled at least as early as 572 BCE, the 33rd year of Nebuchadnezzar. Nanaya Kanat's marriage document was written in the month of Adaru, that year roughly March, in the 5th year of Cyrus, so 533 BCE. Using 572, the earliest dated Yahudu text, as a reference point, and approximating the length of a generation as 25 years, this marriage occurred in at least the 2nd generation of Yahudu's existence as a deportee settlement. If Yahudu was established in the immediate wake of the first exilic wave, the marriage would have occurred in at least the 3rd generation of Judean occupants. Nanaya Kanat's name is West Semitic. There is nothing about her name or that of Dana, her mother, that confirms her identification as a Judean. However, Judeans certainly witnessed the marriage, as evidenced by the Judean and Yahwistic names of several of the witnesses that appear in yellow on the slide. As witnesses were typically drawn from the circle of a principal's associates, friends, or colleagues, and here I differ with Ron, I rather suspect that Nanaya Kanat's father, absent from this document, presumably deceased, may well have been of Judean descent himself. These conclusions, considered together with the dates of the episodes of Babylonian deportations of Judeans and other populations, suggest Nanaya Kanat's father could have been born in Babylonia, although there is a small possibility that he was born in Judah. The contract displays many features typical of marriage contracts of the Neo-Babylonian period. Lines 1 to 10 contain the marriage proposal, stated as the groom's request, "Please give me Nanaya Kanat, your daughter, the maiden, in marriage," and its acceptance by her mother. The operative section of the contract, lines 11 and following, read, "Should Nabu ban Achi release Nanaya Kanat and say she is not my wife, he will bind 6 mina of silver in the hem of her garment. She may go wherever she wishes. Should Nanaya Kanat be found with another man, she will die by the iron dagger." Lines 19, I didn't give the whole clause, contain a rare clause describing the presentation of a garment to the bride's mother. Those lines are then followed by the witnesses and the subscription, and again you can see the Yahwistic or Judean names in the yellow font. There appears a reference to the bride's brother introduced by the uncommon phrase "ina ushuzi," in the presence of. Notably absent from this contract is the mention of a dowry, a point to which we will return. The second text relevant to our study is BM 65149, published as number 17 in Martha Roth's Babylonian Marriage Agreements, and republished in Yigal Bloch's 2014 Judeans in Sippar and Susa during the 1st century of the Babylonian exile. It is the marriage document of the bride Kashaya, whose name is in the pink box, who shared a good Babylonian name with one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. And if you turn your eyes to the green boxes, she is the niece of two Judean Tamkar Shari, royal merchants resident in Sippar. Her father's brothers, Ahiyama and Basia, bear that designation. In the 5th year of Cyrus, Kashaya, daughter of Amushe and Gudadaditu, married a certain Guzanu, son of Kiribati of the Miller clan. As in the Nanaya Khanat contract, the groom offers the marriage proposal to the prospective bride's mother and brother. The bride's Judean patronymic and the groom's Babylonian name, decorated with a clan name, mark this as an example of an exogamous marriage between the elite and the non-elite, the most common form of mixed marriage. The operative section of the contract reads, and I'll try to summarize, you can follow along, she'll die by the iron dagger. If the husband releases her, he will pay her 6 mina of silver. She may return to her father's house. And notably, in this text, there is a dowry that is associated with this marriage. The dowry itself is kind of interesting because it's 1/3 of shekel of probably gold jewelry, a pair of gold earrings worth 1 shekel, an Akkadian bed. Nobody has any idea what this is, but it's probably a mark of some like status. You know, you've got a fancy bed from the elite shop in town. I'm not quite sure. 5 chairs, 1 table. Yeah, you could have a nice dinner party with 5 chairs and 1 table, right? A goblet and a platter of bronze. Okay, so that's her contract, her dowry. And then we have the marriage contract witnesses. And again, I have marked on this slide the Yahwistic or possibly Yahwistic West Semitic names in blue. And I've identified those individuals in the contract who are Tamkar Shari royal merchants in yellow. Kashaya's father, Amushe, bears a Judean name, as does his brother, her uncle, Ahiyama. Ahiyama is designated Tamkar Shari. He appears first in that list, a royal merchant, as are 3 other witnesses to this transaction. The patronymic of one of these additional royal merchants is a Yahwistic name. The other 2 are West Semitic. Mushalamu corresponds to Hebrew Mishulam, a name popular in Hebrew Bible and Elephantine in 5th century. And there's a general consensus that this name may be considered Judean, although not Yahwistic. The name or patronymic Rapé is clearly West Semitic, and opinions differ on its precise interpretation. Ran Sadok counts him among the no less than 8 Judeans witnessing this contract, but Bloch opines that Rapé may be Aramaic rather than Hebrew and bears no distinctly Judean connotations. The Kashaya text preserves the year 5 in the date formula, but the royal name is broken. Its assignment to the reign of Cyrus is achieved with the help of the near duplicate BM 68921, and I'll spare you more Akkadian text. The similarity of language, the 1-month difference in the date, and the preserved signs of the royal titulary, and the space available for a royal name make Cyrus the only plausible contender. The marriage documents of both Nanaya Khanat and Kashaya record marriages shortly after Cyrus's promulgation of his Edict of Return in his first regnal year, as recorded in Ezra 1:1. Although resident in Babylonia, these intermarried brides were contemporaries of individuals who constituted the first community of returnees to Judah. We assume that the returnee population may well have included couples in which one partner was not of Judean origin, and whose marriage would have been formalized according to Babylonian practice. Descendants of that first community later endured Ezra's condemnation. Because of the contemporaneity of the texts I have just presented, the differences between them invites closer attention. First, the texts were written in different locales, presumably each the place of the bride's residence. Second, the bride's families occupied different social environments. Nanaya Khanat was in rural Yahudu and Kashaya in urban Sippar. These settings and the social norms in each would have been familiar to the first families returning to Judah following Cyrus's decree. We will expand on the significance of these features further on, but when we do, we must do so with these cautions in mind. First, the sample size. These are but 2 of the 50 documents included in a recent study by Caroline Varsegers. So at 4%, this sample size reminds us of the very limited evidence of specifically Judean marriages in the Babylonian record. Of course, we're all happy to jump on it. As the corpus of text spans nearly 150 years, or 430 plus years if we include all the marriage documents that date into the late Achaemenid and Hellenistic period, and they cover much of the Babylonian landscape, the sample provides really only snapshots of specific marriages. However, the Judean Babylonian marriage documents illustrate aspects of larger patterns and are valuable if selective evidence. The second caution is that in the cuneiform records of Judean Babylonian marriages, the bride is Judean or West Semitic if we leave open the possibility that Nanaya Kanat was not Judean, and the groom was Babylonian. However, Ezra's pronouncement is directed against Judean grooms who married foreign wives. Although after that first generation of returnees, we must assume most foreign wives were of Levantine origin, we might look for cuneiform evidence of Judean grooms married to Babylonian brides as evidence for the type of intermarriage against which Ezra railed. Unfortunately, no such evidence is yet available, nor do I know of any forthcoming. However, the record of a marriage preserved in the Narab archive suggests possibly that male foreigners could marry Babylonian women. This is the only picture in the whole thing, so if you want pictures, this is the time to look at the screen. The 1926-1927 French excavations at Narab, located southeast of Aleppo, yielded a group of 27 Neo-Babylonian tablets written in the period from Neriglissar to Darius I, 560 to 486. Most texts date to the reign of Nabonidus, the period immediately preceding the return associated with Cyrus's edict. Early assertions that the texts were written in Syria were founded on the facts that they were excavated in Narab, that they included that toponym as their place of composition, and that references to the toponym Beit Dayan Adad included the theophoric element Adad, whose cult enjoyed particular strength in northern Syria. Israel et al.'s 1978 article, The Western Minorities in Babylonia in the 6th to 5th centuries BC, established the now prevailing consensus that the texts were written in a Babylonian Narab, a mirror town to its Syrian counterpart. The dates of the Narab documents suggest deportation of a portion of its population to Babylonia near the end of Nabopolassar's reign or during that of Nebuchadnezzar, corresponding roughly to the Judean relocation to Yahudu. The return of the Narabians occurred during the reign of Darius I, thus post-dating the first return and lying closer to the time of Ezra. To date, the Narab corpus remains the only cuneiform evidence of a deported population's return to its homeland. This heavily damaged or worn text is not as damaged as it looks. In Dorm's edition, records a marriage that occurred prior to Cyrus's reign, probably in the time of Nabonidus. It reads in Roth's translation, Bar Aha, son of Kukiza, came before Nabu-Atir, son of Eazer Idin, and spoke as follows, "Please give me Baziti, your sister, the lass, let her be a wife." Nabu-Atir consented to this proposal and gave him Baziti, his sister, the lass, in marriage. Baziti is the wife of Bar-Aha. Should Baziti, ... Of course, texts break off the most interesting parts. Then we get the list of witnesses. The name of the king is destroyed. It's reconstructed here as Nabonidus, as was suggested by Edward Dorm, the original editor of the text. Mario Fallas considered the possibility of Nabonidus as well as Nebuchadnezzar IV. But in a 2015 study From Syria to Babylon and back, the Narab archive, Gautier Tolini explained that the title King of Babylon would preclude assigning the text to the reign of the Persian kings, as they expanded the titulary to include King of Babylon, King of the lands, or just King of the lands. Thus, the Narab text provides evidence of a wedding that occurred in Babylonia before the accession of Cyrus and prior to the Judean return. Unfortunately, we can't trace the fate of the groom and bride, or more precisely that of their descendants in this text file belonging to the Nusku Galbey family, which returned to Narab along with their little text archive or folio. Neither marriage partner's name appears elsewhere in the corpus, nor is there information to connect them to the families of individuals who do reappear. The section of the text that stipulates penalties for marital misconduct is broken. That's line 9 and following. Yet Caroline Waarsegers reasonably suggests that an iron dagger appeared and that levy of a silver penalty against the groom would be expected. These are penalties consistent with those attested in ethnically mixed marriages. At the same time, this marriage between a groom of West Semitic origin, Bar Achaya, son of Kukiza, to a bride named Bazitu, reinforces the difficulties inherent in employing onomastics as a factor in determining a person's background. The prosopography of the Neo-Assyrian Empire etymologizes the name Bazitu as the woman from Bazu, a region in northern Arabia, but notes that with the CAD, it may be interpreted according to Stam as Efshin, little monkey, or as a foreign word meaning a foreign animal. Both etymologies support identifying the mother as being of West Semitic stock, as was Gudadaditu, the mother of Kashaya, the Judean bride. In the Prozabab database, which focuses on the onomastics of inhabitants of Babylonia between 620 and 330 BCE, the name Bazitu, which appears 11 times in the text from Borsippa, Ur, Babylon, and Sippar, applies with one exception to women of non-elite, even enslaved status. In spite of the West Semitic linguistic background of her name, Bazitu might be considered a Babylonian bride, as her father bore an unambiguously Babylonian name, Ea Zer Idin, as did her brother Nabu Atir, who acts as her agent. A family name does not accompany their personal names, meaning this was not a family of the Babylonian elite. And to be sure, it would be very unexpected to find a member of the Babylonian elite living and establishing a household in the countryside in or around Narab, Babylonia. Where do these three documents fit into the matrix of 4 marriage configurations that Waarsegers has described in her 2020 article, Changing Marriage Practices in Babylonia, from the late Assyrian to the Persian period? The 4 types of marriages are as follows: elite endogamous marriages, members of elite families identifiable by the presence of family names who were often connected to the priestly offices of the temples, and they married among their own. Non-elite endogamous marriages, mostly upper-class merchants or members of the court without family names, whose professions granted them social standing, but who had no connection to the cult, and they too married among their own. In common English usage, the distinction between the terms elite and upper class, at least in common parlance, is largely one of nuance. However, in the context of late first millennium Babylonian social and economic activity, the terms are applied with much more precision. Elite applies to individuals who are descendants of one of a number of hereditary, largely prebendary clans. Their names are presented in the form personal name, son of, father's name, descendant of, clan name. Even within this elite category, there is a status hierarchy of clans or traditional families, terms that we tend to use rather interchangeably. But all individuals with clan names belong to or descend from prebendary families. Upper class, on the other hand, applies to individuals who have achieved some degree of social standing, economic wealth, and are unencumbered by constraints on their personal freedom. Their names may be followed by professional designations, such as we've seen with the title Tamkar Shari. But their name formulas do not include clan names. This feature distinguishes them from the urban elite. In this social stratum, we have abundant evidence for entrepreneurship, especially successful entrepreneurship, conferring a degree of status and social capital. The remaining two categories are more relevant to the present discussion of mixed marriages. These are exogamous marriages between the elite and non-elite, the most common form of mixed marriage. One has a family name, one does not. And ethnically mixed marriages, non-elites marrying persons of non-Babylonian background. The Narab marriage records a deportee marrying into a Babylonian family and falls into the last rubric, the ethnically mixed marriage. It is unusually the marriage of a Babylonian bride to a non-Babylonian groom. The Nanaya Kanat marriage belongs to the same category of ethnically mixed marriages. It does, however, follow the more typical pattern of a non-Babylonian bride and a Babylonian groom. Finally, Kashia's marriage document belongs to the category of mixed marriages in which one partner bears a family name indicating his membership in the urban elite. To be sure, Araru, Miller, was not one of the most prominent prebendary families, but nevertheless it was a mark of social standing. Kashia is a child of an upper-class family, one that enjoys social privilege associated with successful business practices and/or interactions with persons of political power and standing. These three scenarios can be further contextualized against the full picture of Babylonian marriage practices, and I will try to do that before considering whether these express any of the mores of the diaspora against which Ezra would have expressed his consternation. The texts just discussed provide glimpses of the social background of marriage practice in Babylonia in the period of the exile to the early era of return. The texts all predate 484 BCE, the year marking the so-called end of archives, a cessation of archival text production in the cities of Babylon, Borsippa, and Sippar, the latter where Kashia's marriage took place. This dramatic shift in documentation reflects suppression and eviction of the urban elite who had supported the revolts against Xerxes. While elite production of texts and archives ceases after Xerxes' second year in the urban centers, the activities and textual records of urban pro-Persian business families continued as before, as did documentation in rural communities such as the mirror towns in the Nippur vicinity, which were largely populated by lower status Babylonians and ethnic minorities. Among the changes evident in post-484 texts is a harmonization of text components that had previously served to distinguish elite from non-elite marriages. Prior to 484, dowry was the singular concern of marriage documents of the elite. Further evidence for the importance of the dowry to elite families is found in references to it in several hundred related texts, such as dowry receipts, that outnumber the marriage contracts themselves and basically just list items in the dowries. Further, pre-484, fewer than 20% of non-elite marriage documents reference dowry. The major focus was instead on punishments for violations of conventions against adultery, to wit, husbands bore fines in minas of silver, and unfaithful wives were condemned to death by the iron dagger. Kashia's marriage illustrates these practices in action. As a niece of two royal merchants, she belonged to the upper class, and her marriage document details the dowry previously described. Its inclusion is due to the status of her husband. Yet Kashia's marriage up into the urban elite Araru family dictated the inclusion of the iron dagger clause, requisite for all brides whose status was lower than that of their husbands, be they of Shirkuh, oblate class, or even of non-Babylonian ethnicity. Although it is not clear who would have done the deed, and perhaps thankfully there is no record of such a punishment being carried out, the iron dagger clause appeared exclusively in marriage documents of brides lacking a traditional family name, regardless of the family's social standing, as its appearance in Kashia's marriage document makes clear. The Iron Dagger Clause marked and reinforced the outsider status of the bride. Such demarcations of social location were of particular importance among members of the urban elite, who, due to their prebendary status associated with temple service, would have been concerned with preservation of the purity of their family lines. In his 2019 study, The Social World of the Babylonian Priest, an analysis of the social world of the Babylonian elite of Borsippa, Bastian Still examined marriage practices attested in 81 marriages that occurred over 140 years. He discerned the existence of a strict hypergamous marriage system. Within families of the priestly class, daughters of priests married up into families whose rank in the hierarchy was higher than that of their families of origin. As lower-born women married up, dowry assets moved up with them. At some point, the lowest priestly ranks would have been depleted of eligible daughters and would have had to admit women of non-priestly backgrounds in order to keep this system viable. Still emphasized that there isn't sufficient evidence outside of the Borsippa archives to demonstrate the widespread implementation of this hypergamous system. But the marriage of Kashaya, which takes place in Sippar and unites members of two Sippar families, suggests that the system could have operated in multiple urban settings. Even before the end of archives, these clearly defined social lines began to change. As quoting Varsegers, early in the 5th century, the adultery and divorce clauses disappeared from lower-class marriage contracts, signaling a departure from the communal values that had underpinned lower-class marriage at least since the second half of the 7th century, end quote. Written at the end of Darius I's reign, Martha Roth's document 25 shows that a woman without a family name negotiated her own marriage, brought along a dowry, and avoided the dagger clause, all while benefiting with a security settlement in case of divorce. All subsequent documents avoided the Iron Dagger clause and divorce penalty, and by the late 5th century, the dual tiers of marriage systems seem to have been largely abandoned in Babylonia. Varsegers observes that these changes occur at the time of two interconnected developments in Babylonian society: increased economic growth, which supported social mobility and the spread of practices once exclusive to the elite, and two, the social ramifications of the Xerxes revolts, which ended the archives of the northern urban elite and with the prestige of using family names. How or can we read these social trends and changes in Babylonian marriage practices into the discussion of Ezra's problem with foreign wives? While sources available for assessing Judean or any other foreigner Babylonian intermarriage are limited in number, clear Babylonian marriage practice patterns over time and across the Mesopotamian landscape invite us to speculate, and I emphasize speculate, about their impact on Judean marriages in the milieu of cultural contact between exilic age Judeans and Babylonians. Starting from Knopper's assertion that the diasporic community drives the action focused on the native community Ezra depicts, could marriages enacted according to Babylonian norms have influenced and disrupted Judean community norms? If such disruptions existed, did they accelerate with the social dislocation of the Babylonian urban elite? Or, in other words, was Ezra's response conditioned at all by contemporaneous social practice of 6th century Babylonia? Again, quoting Knoppers, the returnees living back in their ancestral territory derive their primary identity neither from their homeland nor from their eponymous ancestor, but from their ancestral links to the diaspora. Individuals who returned to Yehud in the wake of Cyrus's decree could have had exposure to Babylonian marriage and intermarriage customs, the specific customs dependent on an individual's status. I rather suspect that some of the returnees themselves intermarried, those in the first generation of the return in Babylonia. Until 484, the strict hypergamy of the Babylonian elite intentionally precluded entrance of non-elites into the circle of the priestly class, except in exceptional circumstances. Members of the Judean priestly lines, concerned with the purity of their own lines, adhered to their own traditional injunctions. Can we imagine that there were circumstances under which Judean grooms of the priestly line would have been constrained in their efforts to marry a woman from outside the community, perhaps even without regard to her descent? If this occurred prior to 484, we might venture to posit that such brides were of upper-class origins, just as was Kashaya, the Judean bride who married into the Araru family. In short, in long 6th century Babylonia, foreign wives married to Judean husbands would not have been a new phenomenon when Ezra encountered them on his return to Jerusalem in the middle of the 5th century. If Judean men were marrying non-Judean brides prior to Ezra's time, the Babylonian practices provided clear means for protecting the appropriate lines of temple-connected urban families. The intermarriages illustrated in the non-elite ethnically mixed marriages would have had little impact on the preservation of priestly lines. However, the urgency of the temple rebuilding project and Ezra's authorization to implement the law of his people in the land coincided with accelerating social changes in Babylonia, and thus increased perceptions of the threats of intermarriage to the priestly line. As the urban priestly class was sublimated and social strictures eased, non-elite and upper-class families married in the same way. These changes began to appear in the Babylonian record about 1 generation before Ezra, and thus the permeability of the social boundaries would have been relatively well established by the time of his mission. In view of the new understanding of shifts in Babylonian marriage practices which occurred in the wake of Xerxes' reign, we see that the political motivation for the suppression of the urban elite lay closely bound up with the power of the traditional urban Babylonian cult. As long as those lines remained intact, families who benefited from cultic economy retained power. By 458, Babylonian society had experienced a generation of social transformation. Certainly in the cities, social and power hierarchies had been realigned. Rural areas increasingly supported the expansion of entrepreneurship and wealth along with their privileges. Gone were many privileges of access to political power, and so too, apparently, the strict adherence to the hypergamous marriage system. These transformations occurred in the host world of the diaspora prior to Ezra's return to the land. Thus, he would bring those experiences with him to the land, a bundle of economic and political changes that contributed to the transnational and transtemporal shape of his mission and the people's development. The narrative establishes the strong and direct link of Ezra to the homeland, even as he lived primarily in the diaspora. Ezra's experience reflects the existence of 2 Judean communities situated in 2 locales, which share many social religious structures, some of which, notably marriage practices, were maintained over several generations with little development. This may be true in many aspects of religious identification and practice, but the situation with social and legal structures may be more nuanced, as our look at Babylonian marriage practices illustrates. While we can only confirm the existence of a Judean-Babylonian intermarriage in pre-return Babylonia, we can reasonably assume that the Judean community, including or especially after 484 and into the time of Ezra, lived according to the social norms of the host society. That is, we might expect ongoing intermarriage and increasing social and economic integration into a Achaemenid Babylonian society in both instantiations of the Judean community. Although Ezra's pronouncement is sweeping, issues of intermarriage are not fully resolved, as Nehemiah's struggles illustrate. The persistence of long-standing social conventions continued to plague the community working towards full restoration of its religious mission and identity. The first millennium Babylonian world, into which the Judeans and others were exiled or deported, had long been receptive to foreigners, even before Nebuchadnezzar's deportations brought significant-sized populations to the demographic landscape. They found reasonable accommodation in most strata of society, save the urban elite. In the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Judeans are attested as a bow fief holder and as a tenant farmer, and by the reign of Nabonidus, as a royal merchant in Sippar. In addition to the Judeans, Egypto-Carians were assigned into the care of the Borsippa elite and may have served as substitutes for the latter's military obligations. Egyptians served as temple slaves and free individuals of Egyptian origin were associated with the early Persian court. Ethnically mixed intermarriage occurred across all of these communities, with the sole constraint until 484 being the line defining the Babylonian urban elite. But even there, social standing conferred a degree of entree, one in which Judean families could enjoy access. Thus, the Judeans, who lived in Babylonia from the exile until 539 and the first return, lived in a mixed society. They moved from one geographic pole to another, from the new experience in Babylon back to their distant ancestral homeland. While those links served as a primary shaper of identity formation, the returned Judeans and their descendants could not fully set aside their experience in Babylon. I hope that today, in reviewing Babylonian marriage practices and considering formulations that contribute to the shaping of Babylonian society, including its non-native populations, I have drawn attention to changes impacting all levels of society after a significant social disruption in 484, and have suggested ways that these changes contributed to the expression of Ezra's fundamentally theological mission in its concerns with the restoration of Judean identity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Laurie.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Always wonderful. I was wondering, out of the hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets that there are for the time period that you're dealing with, there's very, very few marriage contracts. And that, of course, suggests that this is very exceptional. So it seems to me like they're precisely written because there's something not normal going on in whatever marriage is happening. And I'm wondering if we can say something about this being not normal precisely because of this, and what your thoughts are on.
As the provision in the Neo-Babylonian laws states, it seems that a verbal agreement was enough to make a marriage. And that would be the very straightforward, okay, everything's fine, we don't anticipate any socioeconomic, interethnic issues. Yes, these examples are exceptional. Most of the marriage documents do include something where people are from different circles, for lack of a better term. And I think that's what's exceptional.
So could we, I know it's really pushing it, say that intermarriage actually was exceptional, or no, really couldn't say that. I'm just asking.
I don't know. We don't have a record of, a Babylonian farmer and a Judean tenant farmer who are both equally poor and just say, okay, let's get these two kids married and set up a new family without anything. So each of these has some unique feature. I wouldn't want to push that hard on it.
Okay, just wondering your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So thank you, Laurie. I'm here.
Okay. I heard the voice.
Thanks, Laurie, for this great presentation. And just a quick comment on the Nane Kanat contract, which I find fascinating from a different perspective, but kind of complements what you just said. It has its oath. Like you said, all of the witnesses are Yahwistic, have Yahwistic names practically. But the oath at the end of the contract is on the triad of Marduk, Zapanitu, and Nabu. So they basically, the entire contract, which is basically between Yahwistic, or at least the milieu is Yahwistic, is signed with an oath on the local triad. So in terms of the Yahwistic, kind of the Yahwism of the period, there is a clear adoption or assimilation of these.
Yeah, I don't know whether that is just indicative of you've got a Babylonian scribe, and this is the standard form. that he includes.
Do we have this anywhere else?
I don't remember that there being any others, but I don't see it as particularly problematic.
No, I'm not saying
Yeah.
it's interesting.
It's just, no, it's
Yeah.
absolutely, it is absolutely interesting. You know, but we could go back to Yahu Sharotzer and Baal Sharotzer, so there is this kind of,
Okay, and the
mixed
second
milieu.
comment is you should have called this better than Ezra. That's a rock group, if you don't know the reference.
Please, you said Meshulam. You normalized this, or you identified this name, this poem, Mushalamu. Is written.
I don't hear you, Ron, I'm sorry.
You identified the form Mushalamu. It's not Meshalem. Mushalamu. This is written phonetic. Mushalamu with Meshulam. Meshulam, it would be Mushulamu. Not Mushalamu is an Aramaic name,
Okay.
not a Hebrew name,
Okay.
linguistically. So the family had no Hebrew names. The family had no Hebrew names. as I
Okay.
said.
James.
Thanks. This is very helpful. I look forward to using the paper whenever you get it done. So we do have some categories. People of suspicion, right? Foreign marriages, or there's some sort of protection of something going on there, and we presume maybe an economic protection in some way in the end at the cause of death or divorce or something like this. So there's suspicion to start it. But then there's the family issue, the clan issue, which is, as we always talk about, based on this prebendary system. And I'm wondering, is there any evidence, maybe it would be outside of these, but that the temple has an interest, an economic interest in this? We talk about the prebendary system from the economic interest of the clan who takes the prebendary on, but it seems to me that we might also talk about the responsibility of the temple in this regard.
Yeah, I don't remember if Still discusses this, and maybe I can pull Jason into the discussion, but I sort of have the suspicion that this whole dowry piece, I wouldn't be surprised if that weren't part of the temple's economic interest.
This is why I ask, because the dowries, what the women bring into the marriages in a couple of the Elephantini contracts are these extremely valuable vessels and such, and things that look like the temple vessel taxation stuff that we saw, that I tried to show pictures
Yeah.
of. And I was wondering, is there maybe any economic...
Yeah. Jason, do you remember any specific discussion of yeah, okay, of the dowry going into the temple? Yeah. Yeah.
The dowry doesn't go to the temple. It remains her property. The whole point of the dowry is if there is a divorce, she has
Just
something to
to-
live off of. Yeah.
She's also an economic entity in the community, and so she's part of this larger system. And I'm wondering,
Yes.
if she is divorced, then do we have any, especially if she's part of the prebendary system already, that's going to be taxed, there's obligations that she has to pay. And I'm wondering if we can talk about maybe outside of these contracts, the larger evidence that we have in the socioeconomic world of these marriages. Because again, there's so few of them.
Yeah.
Yes, I think actually Caroline wrote about it in her Borsit book, if I remember correctly.
She has the book on the marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she has this massive
There's-
volume on the Izida, and talks about principles of who's allowed to become a priest. And so, like, you have to have the right to prebend to become a priest, but if you're a woman, you're not allowed to become a priest. But you can still
Yeah.
have the right to prebend, and this complication.
Oh.
But it's been a while since I've read
Yeah.
that book. I have to admit.
I always wanted to think of marriage as a completely civil thing.
Marriage is always complicated. But no, I'd like, James, I would definitely like to continue the discussion. Yeah, yeah. Margaretha?
At Elephantini, the dowry list is not always a rich one. That is what
Yeah.
I would like to add. There's a slavewoman dowry list, which in fact is a very
Modest.
modest list.
Yeah.
Yeah. For marriage, exactly. Yeah.
I think you have a question as well, but then Reinhard, I'm not sure, and then Margaret may have had more. So let's see what we can fit in.
I actually had a question somewhat related to James. I was gonna say, I think taking in considerations of class is actually really useful and is irrelevant to whether or not Ezra exists and is dating, because it's a social mechanism for maintaining power,
Yeah.
essentially, right? Regardless of the exact economic situation behind it. And it's a good thing, or I think another useful way to think about what might be happening in this passage, right? Who has the right to marry is explicitly limiting who has access to the power that comes with access to the temple.
Yeah. I was just very struck, and here I ask the people who are at home in biblical studies, I was very struck by, the date of Ezra and the clear, the 484 line, and that we see this shift in the way marriage is constructed and sort of this opening up. I'm still sort of mulling over what to do with that, but the archival structures stay, archival structures, they were all sort of these small rural deposits of tablets. But the fact that Caroline has mapped out these changes in wedding practices, marriage practices, where things are becoming more open, just spoke to me about sort of this increasingly mixed milieu and Ezra's response to it. But yeah, I agree with you that it is very much a statement of power and social ordering.
So, thank you very much. And I found this very, very helpful to get an overview of indeed the cases in Mesopotamia, and to see that what you say, it's an intermarriage and so on, is rather a social phenomenon. And that's an interesting point, I think, rather a social classy phenomenon. You can observe it today in England or something like this.
Yeah.
Still. This is very, very helpful. But I would like to ask you to just to explain me, and I'm sorry, maybe I didn't get the point because my English is really poor. I didn't get the point. What exactly did Ezra saw in Babylonia? And what did he saw and imported with the people who actually didn't want to come with him, but then maybe came with him back? When he came to Judah and recognized in Judah and said, well, now I have to do this, and this is his reform, because neither the social thing nor any other thing you talked about in this Mesopotamian context, I cannot see actually in the Ezra documents. The reasoning is completely different. The constellation is completely different. I didn't see any analogy somehow. So I would like to ask, maybe I'm sure I didn't get the point actually, because I didn't understand it, that you explain what did Ezra see, what he brought with him to Judah, and what is the reason for his reform there?
Yeah, I am still working this out, but I think what the group that went back in the early return was operating with the old system of hierarchies. I think Ezra would have seen an expanding of intermarriages in Babylonia as economic conditions were changing and this post end of archives time frame. I think when he went back, I think that he had a theological motive at mind and saw that the social and economic changes were increasingly, or were a threat to that. So maybe I need to rethink this all a little bit more carefully.
Okay, yeah. I mean, about the first, if I may just add this, about the what you call the first wave. Actually, we don't. I wouldn't know who it is. I mean, it's nothing told about them. It's just a projection you think about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because I mean, this girl married there in Al Yahud. I mean, if you just marry in the third year of Cyrus, you won't go to
No,
Judah.
no,
You
no,
would
no,
have your
no, no,
existence
no.
in
But
Babylonian.
but I think those
I'm
are the
happy here,
conditions.
you
Those
know.
are the conditions of
Yeah,
any some of her contemporary. You know, people who went back would have known these marriage conditions and could have either gone back married. Maybe they're married 10 years before, something like that, or that they brought those practices with them and accepted intermarriage back in Judah, and that this was not a problem. Okay, but I will rethink.
I wondered, I thought the other day we established that the exiles were mainly the elite. So, and also I wondered, so I don't think we were worried about the farmer's daughter getting married somewhere or other. But what was the corpus that you dealt with? How many tablets or how many marriages did you have that you analyzed exactly?
The only ones dealing with Judeans or exile, I mean, there are about 50 marriage documents that are fairly usable, most of them include a Babylonian and a non-Babylonian. Insofar as the Judeans or the West Semites who might be Judeans or have Judean friends and colleagues, it's this group of three. Okay, but in terms of who was exiled, it's unlikely, I think, that they put goldsmiths out in the countryside to do tenant farming. So I suspect that we had some farmers, maybe lower level craftsmen, going out to the countryside. We have, as I mentioned, a Judean receives a bow fief, which means he's obligated to do military service in exchange for that land. Among the first, 10 years of the documentation that we've got. Well, assuming he came in 586, yeah, I suppose he could learn to farm in 10 years if he had been a goldsmith, but I really don't believe it. I think that there were people out of the elite circle who were resettled. Okay. And I remember having a discussion with Israel F. Al about this. He said, when they first started reading the Marashu text, it was like, where did all these Judean farmers come from? And because based on the Weidner lists in Babylon, it's the king, his sons, and if you look by comparison, you have Egyptian craftsmen. So in Babylon, it's the elite. But out here, we're talking about farmland that had really been devastated in the wars between Assyria and Babylonia, and Nebuchadnezzar was trying to rebuild the agricultural program. So, I think he put lots of farmers out there.
On the other hand, they didn't know when they were going back. So if your daughter or son was a marriageable age,
Yep.
you just, she fell in love or he fell in love.
Well, I
and that
doubt
was
it was a question of falling in love. I think it was all economic in those days. So.
3 minutes, I think, so follow.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I don't have my Tanakh here, but as you read the section of Ezra, you mentioned Zerah HaKodesh. And when I taught this, I found that the matter of purity played a major role. And I don't know exactly, I can't read the text to see exactly where purity falls, but I think that unless you take this Zerah HaKodesh seriously, then you're not really dealing with the situation that Ezra faced.
Again, I'm working this through, and I appreciate both your comments. This whole notion of there being a system that protected the priestly families in Babylonia is now collapsing. So maybe he's seeing this collapse of this sacred line, sacred lineage. Okay. Jason?
I just had a comment on the question of elite. I mean, there's two issues. The biblical text claims it was elites, but they had been elites when they were deported. It's not the same thing as remaining elites after they've been deported. And if you look at the use of imperial forced labor regimes throughout history, they don't care what you did before. They have something they want, and they want you to do it. And usually they're not going to give you what you need to do it, and they will punish you for not having done it. Right? This is sort of completely irrelevant. They could have been a goldsmith. They don't know anything about farming. Well, you're going to starve, or learn how to farm.
Most of the taxi drivers are Iranians, and they have a PhD.
Yeah, they have PhDs.
They have a PhD,
Yeah,
and they're taxi drivers now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, God, is this the end of our session?
The end is near.